This segment of the Chopin podcast is brought to you by the Chopin Foundation of the United States, presenters of the National Chopin Competition in Miami, Florida, January 2025.
What is Chopin's music about? Well, in the case of the ballades, many musicians have had an answer to that for almost 2 centuries now. They represent different poems of Chopin's compatriot, Adam Mickiewicz. The literary ballad, in Mickiewicz's words, was an epic tale animated by strangeness and sung in a melancholy tone. And Chopin seems to have been inspired by this romantic narrative genre in his own musical ballades. But whatever Chopin's source of inspiration was, for biographer Alan Walker, the very question of what particular story Chopin's ballades tell is a mistaken one. I'm excited to welcome back to the show Alan Walker, professor emeritus at McMaster University in Ontario, Canada, best known for his magisterial 3-volume biography of Franz Liszt. Walker recently published an authoritative biography of Chopin, and the forthcoming second edition of that biography will feature a new essay by Walker on Chopin's 4th Ballade, including the story behind its composition. In the end, it is this true story, more than any other poem in proximity, that gives us the best insight into Chopin's state of mind when he was writing one of the greatest pieces of music composed in the 19th century. Here is Alan Walker.
The F minor ballad, without any question, is a musical masterpiece. And when I use the term masterpiece, I'm not thinking of anything vague. I'm really saying that a masterpiece is something that you cannot consume through use. However many times you hear it, you want to hear it again. And when you do hear it again, you uncover new truths and new feelings and new aspects, features of these pieces that you were unaware of before. In my view, the F minor ballad is not only the greatest of the 4 ballads, it is one of the very great compositions that Chopin ever composed. Indeed, one of the great compositions of the 19th century. And it didn't ascend to this lofty position overnight. In fact, it is really one of Chopin's most private compositions. And it was born out of an episode in his life, which is not well known to professional pianists, but is becoming increasingly well known to biographers. Now, the summer of 1842 was particularly painful for Chopin. He had the sketch of the F minor ballad on his writing desk in his apartment in the Square d'Orléans, where he lived. But at that time, one of his best Polish friends, a medical doctor, Jan Maciuszynski, was mortally ill. And Chopin and George Sand went over to Maciuszynski's apartment to nurse him through his dying moments. And we have an account from George Sand in which she said that Chopin was so mortally upset, so frightened at what he saw, that she feared for Chopin's own life, because Maciuszynski actually died in George Sand's arms. The death struggle lasted for 3 or 4 days, and what Chopin was actually witnessing was not only the death of one of his dear Polish friends, but his own future, because he knew at that time that he also had tuberculosis, and this was a likely end for him as well. So he went back to his apartment, picked up the sketches of the F minor ballad, with his friend's death fresh on his mind, only to be sideswiped by another tragedy. He heard that his dear piano teacher, Adalbert Zwinny, had passed away. Now, within a week, 2 of these precious links with his Polish childhood were gone. And I can only assume that the emotional turmoil in Chopin's mind had to boil over somehow. And I assume, and it is simply an assumption, that it boiled over in the F minor ballad. There's ample evidence that in this ballad, the passion and the rage and the sheer turmoil that was going on in Chopin's mind is reflected in his music. That is just my personal opinion, and other listeners may have their own points of view. But the ballad itself did not come from outside. It came from, in Schopenhauer's words, from the life of the mind, or rather from the will. Unlike other art products, such as painting or poetry or drama, everything depends on the outside world. For a painter, he's copying something. For a dramatist, when we go into the theatre, we're witnessing a stage, an episode, or a scene on the platform, the auditorium unfolding before us. But this is not what happens in music, and it's certainly not what happens in Chopin's music.
I've studied the ballades for many years, and I've also read about them, and I've been to master classes with great distinguished pianists who play them beautifully, and very often the legends of Adam Mickiewicz, they seem to have captured the imagination of many pianists and listeners, and whether or not they're drawing direct associations between Chopin and this epic poetry, at least that it gives them a sense that, yes, this is a literary genre. Chopin is participating in the sort of telling of tales, of spinning epic narratives of sorts that do on some level are inspired by a literary form. And I wonder if you could just speak to the ballade as a genre, and specifically if you could begin to broach this question of programs in Chopin's ballades, specifically with Adam Mickiewicz. But first, maybe just what is a ballade in history, and how did it inspire Chopin? I mean, he did name them ballades after all.
And he sowed a lot of mischief along the way by doing so. For me, the ballades are self-explanatory. They are things in themselves. They don't require any verbal explanation whatsoever. And the fact that later commentators, starting with Robert Schumann, as early as 1841, in his magazine The Neue Zeitschrift für Musik, ever since then, there's been an attempt to turn these wonderful pieces of music into baby talk, as if we can't really understand them without having some tales or legends woven around them. Now, having said that, Chopin and Mickiewicz were familiar with one another. They were colleagues. Mickiewicz also was a Polish exile. He lived in Paris at the same time as Chopin, and Chopin attended some of the lectures given by Mickiewicz on the origins and the influence of the Slavic language. And we know from George Sand, who went to those lectures with him, what an impact Mickiewicz had, particularly on the Polish expatriates who were there living in Paris. Later on, Mickiewicz became a neighbor of Chopin, and they saw one another really quite frequently. But the idea that this epic bard, this voice of Poland, namely Mickiewicz himself, had any influence on the Chopin ballades is something that I've never been able to accept. I think possibly that Alfred Cortot, in his celebrated edition of Chopin's music, and especially the volume that he devotes to the ballads, did a great deal of damage unwittingly by attaching stories from Mickiewicz to each one of the ballads. In the case of the fourth ballad, Cortot was of the opinion that it represented the story of the three Budrys, the three Lithuanian brothers, or the three adventurers, who were instructed by their father to go out into the external world in search of their fortune. And there are various adventures along the way, which the ballad is supposed to represent. And the three brothers eventually return to their homeland, not with wealth and money, but with three Polish brides. Now, I can only say that if you believe that, you believe anything. You can, of course, stretch the story or even stretch the music itself to fit the facts of the case. But by so doing, you distort everything. You distort the story and you distort the piece as well. But of course, Cortot went further than that because he attached stories to all four of the ballads, as I said a little earlier. Now, Cortot, of course, has an unassailable position as a Chopin expert, and his recordings are revered, quite rightly, all over the world. But I think in this particular case, he did us great disservice by saying, in effect, the ballads are really about these poems. And I have to say that they're not. If we had not got this reminiscence of Robert Schumann in that review of 1841, in which he's referring back to memories of a conversation he had with Chopin 5 years earlier, I don't think we would be having this conversation today. But there are possibly two little trivial footnotes that I can add to all of this, although you may not find them so trivial when I've told you what they are. When Chopin had finished this particular piece, he decided to dedicate it to Charlotte de Rothschild. Now, you may say, well, who is Charlotte de Rothschild? And you might be surprised. She was 17 years old, a mere child. What on earth was Chopin thinking of when he dedicated one of his most important piano compositions to this child? Well, as we now know, it was really a wedding gift. Charlotte was about to marry her cousin, Nathaniel, an Englishman who was born and brought up in London. It was an attempt to keep the family wealth together. But the interesting thing is that Charlotte developed a love of Chopin's music. She acquired many of his manuscripts, and she eventually donated them to the Paris Conservatoire, and she continued to grow Chopin's music until she died, and she lived a very, very long life. So in a sense, that was her thank you to Chopin for dedicating this wonderful work to her. I don't think she could play it. In fact, I'm convinced she could never play such a piece. I don't think, in fact, the ballad was ever played publicly during Chopin's lifetime, which is another story for another time. But the other piece of trivia, which I think is more important, is that after the ballad was finished, Chopin sat down and he wrote a letter to Breitkopf and Härtel, his publishers, and he said, "My dear sirs, I would like to offer you two of my compositions. The first is a Polonaise in A-flat major. That's the Opus 53, the heroic Polonaise, the one that everybody knows. And the other work is the F minor ballad. Now, for the Polonaise, I would like to ask 500 francs. But for the ballad, I want 600 francs. Yours sincerely, Frédéric Chopin, P.S. Please let me know by return post what you can do." Now, if money or financial amounts can be translated into artistic worth, what Chopin was actually telling us, in that in his view, the ballad was more important than the Polonaise. And that, of course, contradicts the view of the world at large, because this Polonaise has become synonymous not only with Chopin, but with Poland, Polish resistance, etc. The moment you hear the first two or three measures of that Polonaise, you think, oh, Chopin, Poland, the resistance, the revolution, etc., etc. And the ballad, of course, is not even thought of in those terms. But for Chopin, the ballad was a far more important work because he wanted more money for it. That's a biographer's point of view. A musician may have a different point of view. He may not need any information that the biographer cares to give him. But I do think if you know something about what was going on in a parallel way in Chopin's life while he was in his apartment in the Square d'Orléans, wrestling with this ballad, we know from the sketches that he had a pretty rough time with this, rougher than usual, because the pages are filled with crossings out and emendations, additions, subtractions, etc., until everything was in place. I'm reminded, by the way, when we think of Chopin's composing process, that he was always a dual personality. His compositions started out as improvisations. He really couldn't start composing unless his fingers touched a keyboard, and once he was in touch with a keyboard, the ideas would start to flow, and it would be an improvisation. But then the other side of his personality would kick in. The composer would appear, and the composer was absolutely, utterly ruthless in dealing with the improviser. The composer would not let the improviser get away with anything until all the corrections had been made, all the surplus notes had been removed, all the ones that were originally missing had been put back into place, and only then, after 2 months perhaps, of the struggle, would the manuscript and the piece be complete. And so that was the process going on in the summer of 1842, and is the background to the ballad.
I think that's most convincing, that Chopin begins his compositions with touch, not with some preconceived notion of correspondence between some tale he wants to spin at the keyboard. He has feelings. He's lived a life. He's in a state of mind, a state of emotion, and of course that bears on what comes out at the keyboard. But it doesn't translate into, I was reading some Mickiewicz recently, and I want to now make a soundtrack for this story. But you seem to be suggest that program music, at least in the the case that it's attached to Chopin is belittling, condescending baby talk. But you're the great champion of Liszt. Do you think Liszt cheapened his music by attaching all of these extra musical associations to it?
But, well, you've opened a vast subject here. My quick answer to that is that anyone who reads the preface that Liszt wrote to his symphonic poems will immediately change their mind as to what program music is. Because Liszt seizes this dilemma. He looks at this problem head on, and he says, music simply cannot express the outside world. Those are his words. He said, a painter, the most humble painter with a set of paints and a brush, can make a better job of depicting the outside world than a musician can. What Liszt was saying is that when I attach titles to my piece of music, I'm not saying that this is what the music is about. I'm saying that this is what inspired me to write the piece. So if he gives a title such as By a Spring, or Orage, a Storm, or the Villa d'Este, the Sapricet of the Villa d'Este, he's not saying that the piece is about those scenes. He's actually saying that when he witnessed them, he was inspired to pick up his pen and to compose a piece which could not have been born, perhaps, without the inspiration of the scenes of nature or the scenes of drama or the scenes of painting, because Liszt was inspired by so many things, and he gives the inspiration away by the titles. So I suppose what I'm really doing is attacking, but I'm doing it in Liszt's name, of the entire idea of program music, that music somehow can represent the feelings or the images and the sounds of the outside world.
I respect that, because why should music have to depend on other art forms and sensory experiences for it to mean something?
Exactly. But there's something else, of course, to be said here. I would advise all your viewers to read Schopenhauer on this. He is really the musician's philosopher. And he looks at this problem, and he says that all the arts, save music, have one thing in common, that they are reflections of the outside world, but not music. Music comes from inside. It comes from the will. It is a copy of the will. It doesn't require words. And Mendelssohn, of course, caught hold of this idea in that wonderful aphorism of his when he said that music begins where words leave off. Music is really too deep for words.
And yet, as piano teachers, which pianists often are, including Chopin, we have to get students to stimulate their imaginations. And often we do this with imagery. We say, imagine this, imagine that. In fact, Chopin is on record of having used imagery and associations with his own works. For example, the Etude Opus 25, number 1. So maybe you could speak to the fact that Chopin himself refers to extra musical things when, I guess, trying to inspire students or even trying to get them to understand something about the meaning of his work. This could also be cause for confusion for those who might believe that actually there is representationalism in Chopin's music.
Well, I suppose my reply can be reduced to 3 words. Where's the harm? It does no harm whatsoever to use imagery and other stimulants to encourage students to play better. If you wish to fill their minds with stories and say this represents this and this represents that, in order to produce the effect that you as the teacher feel that the student ought to be producing, then that's fine. But let's not fall into the trap of saying that this is what the music is actually reflecting.
So then the life of the mind, which is a phrase you've used, which this music does reflect, or it does seem to come from, or have its origins in the life of the mind. Of course, the mind is part of the world, but our experience is really what you're referring to, and that's something that can't be so reduced to third person external sorts of observations and associations.
Just to refer back to a conversation we were having a couple of days ago about the raindrop prelude, George Sand tells us that in 1838, when she and her son Maurice were caught in a storm and were delayed, and they arrived back at the monastery in Valdemosa very late at night, they found Chopin frightened to death that they had vanished in the storm, and he was working on this prelude with the repeated A-flats and the G-sharps in the middle section. And George Sand said that he had actually imitated the sounds of nature by listening to the falling water drops on the roof of the monastery. We must remember that that event that she was recalling, that evidently took place in 1838, was not known to anyone in the outside world until 1855, 17 years later, when she sat down to write her reminiscences, The Story of My Life. Now, can you remember what you were doing at a specific day at a specific time a month ago? I can't. Here she is, writing at a desk, rearranging her memories, and claiming to recall in great detail something that happened on a particular day, on a particular night, rather, in the middle of a storm in Valdemosa in the winter of 1838. It beggars belief. And yet her account is the one that musicians generally have accepted, although if they were to go back to the early editions of the Chopin preludes, they would not find the raindrop prelude anywhere listed. It is simply prelude number 15 in D-flat major. The appellation raindrop was added in later editions, thanks in large part to what George Sand had to tell us when she was fantasizing.
May I defend George Sand just a little, because I looked up this passage in her book, and yes. I'm going to read it to you now.
Okay.
He was and so he was even angry at what I translated by the expression imitative harmony. He vehemently protested, and he was right, against the naivete of believing his notes to have been aural imitations. His genius, full of mysterious harmonies of nature, translated them into sublime equivalents in his music, and not by servile imitation of sounds. His composition that evening was certainly full of raindrops resonating on the tiles of a monastery, but they were perhaps translated in his imagination and in his music into tears from heaven falling on his heart. That's more nuanced, I think, than this sense of, oh, he heard some raindrops and he wrote a piece about them.
Well, may I respond?
Yes.
I think it's Mark Twain who tells us that nothing spoils a good story like the arrival of an eyewitness. And we have an eyewitness. Namely, Robert Graves, the great historian who spent more than 50 years of his life living on the island of Mallorca. He knew Valdemosa and he knew the monastery very well. And he said it was absolutely impossible for Chopin or George Sand to hear raindrops falling on the roof because the architecture of the monastery would not allow it. I have been to that monastery maybe 3 times now. Once I witnessed the most horrific rainstorm. For part of that storm, I was inside the monastery. You cannot hear a sound because the structure of that building is so solid, you really don't know what's going on outside. So who are we to believe? George Sand, writing 17 years later about raindrops, or Robert Graves, who lived there for 50 years, knew the architecture intimately, and said it would have been impossible. So I rest my case.
While the facts may not work in George Sand's favor, her nickname for Chopin's D-flat prelude continues to stick. Whatever damage the rain may have done in narrowing popular interpretations of this work, it is nevertheless a testament to Chopin's music that it has stimulated the imaginations of so many musicians of his time and to this day. That was certainly true for Robert Schumann, who hailed Chopin a genius after discovering his Opus 2 variations on a duet from Mozart's Don Giovanni. Schumann excitedly penned a review in which he assigned specific scenes from the opera to each of Chopin's variations, to which Chopin responded, "I could die laughing at this German's imagination." Although the admiration was hardly mutual, Chopin would go on to dedicate his second ballade to Schumann, after Schumann had dedicated his Kreisleriana to Chopin. In many of his compositions, Schumann straddles the worlds of absolute music and program music, often adorning his pieces with titles invoking imaginary characters inspired by literature, and sometimes actual people inspired by his own real-life experiences. Indeed, one of those pieces, from Schumann's Carnaval, Opus 9, is named Chopin. So while there might not be any good answer to the question, what is Chopin's music about, when it comes to this music by Schumann, apparently it's about Chopin. Can't you tell? This episode has been brought to you by the Chopin Foundation of the United States. Established by Lady Blanka Rosenstiel in 1977, the Chopin Foundation has championed the music of Chopin and helped launch the careers of countless young American pianists for nearly a half-century. To support the Chopin Foundation, visit chopin.org/donate.